Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to just, really excited for this Public Humanities workshop today. I'm going to go ahead and actually start with a land acknowledgement activity. And so I'm joining from Portland, Oregon today, and I'm going to put in the chat actually a tool that some of you may be familiar with about how you can find out what Indigenous lands you are on, whose lands and waters you're living on. I'm joining from what has come to be called Portland, Oregon, and I want to affirm that these are the rightful homelands of the Multnomah, Molalla, Kalapuya, Chinook, Clackamas, Tenino, Wasco, Bushram, Paiute, and many other Native people who live here and have always lived here, have always belonged to and cared for this land and water, and whose bold resistance to colonial oppression should guide us all. So I invite everyone to offer your own land and water acknowledgement in the chat. But I also want to take some time beyond recognition to invite us to reflect on how we can take action as beyond land and water recognition, how we can take action. So we're going to do a short activity. So grab something to write with. This practice is inspired by a practice I learned from an organization called BARC, Defenders of Mount Hood, and it's a reflective acknowledgement practice. The aim is to guide non-Indigenous participants toward developing personal connection and personal goals for the work of supporting Indigenous sovereignty. And so you're welcome to turn your video off if you would like. As we go through this practice. So I'm going to just put the practice up on the screen for everyone to see. We ask that all non-Indigenous participants practice humility, respect, and acknowledgement with us by personally dedicating your time, energy, action, and resources to support the people who rightfully belong to the land and water. So as I said, please get something to write with, and I'm going to ask you to take the next 2 minutes to write some instructions, intentions, actions, and next step for yourself, outlining how you will develop your practice of acknowledgement through action. And so some animating questions or prompts. What actions are you prepared to take to honor the original people here today across the US and around the globe in the past, present, and future? If you've set intentions in the past, you might take this time to reflect on your past efforts and update your intentions and action plan. So I'm actually going to mute myself and turn off my video as I take these 2 minutes, and we'll be back with you in a moment. You can start to wrap up your writing, and I invite you to move your thinking away from yourself and take another minute or so to give yourself the space to practice humility and gratitude, any of the things that have come up for you while you were reflecting and writing, and really direct that outside of yourself to the communities most impacted by colonization, the theft of land, the genocide of cultures. And as folks begin to come back and turn cameras back on, hopefully there's a different energy present in the room here as we're moving forward. And I want to welcome anyone from Indigenous communities to take this space right now, if you'd like to, if it suits you, to add any thoughts or comments. I understand that this practice focuses on non-Indigenous people and our learning, and that's burdensome in a lot of ways. All right, well, I hope you will use me as a resource during this workshop so that this space serves everyone. I welcome anyone who is open to it to share your action items and intentions in the chat so we all can learn other ways that we might put action behind our recognition and acknowledgement. I believe the chat is available to participants. So, and hopefully this has warmed us up for our workshop today. Before we dive in, I'm just going to put a quick poll on the screen. Would love to hear from ASLE graduate students about future topics for workshops. We're planning 2 other workshops this year. And so if you could, I'm just going to launch the poll. If you could just pick 2 of this long list of topics that are most useful to you, that would be great. And we'll use your feedback to plan our future workshops. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. It looks like almost everyone has participated who would like to. Okay, thank you for that. Cassie, would you mind? I don't know if it's going to save the poll results, but could you just make a quick note? Everyone, this is Cassie Galantine. She's the junior graduate student liaison for ASLE, who's assisting me here today. I didn't introduce myself. Also, I'm Lisa Fink, the senior graduate student liaison for ASLE. So I'm going to go ahead and start with introductions. I'm just going to introduce everyone who is going to be presenting today all at once, and then we'll dive into the presentations. So, all right, let me get to my notes here. So our first group of presenters is going to be talking about their project against the eco-fascist creep. So I'm going to introduce all of them just alphabetically. So Dr. April Anson, who's here with us today, is an assistant professor of public humanities at San Diego State University, core faculty for the Institute of Ethics and Public Policy, and affiliate faculty in American Indian Studies. Her research explores the historical and ongoing connections between climate change, white supremacy, and the American environmental imagination, while also attending to Indigenous environmental justice traditions that eclipse those relations. Dr. Anson was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania with a Penn program in environmental humanities, and her work has appeared or is forthcoming in Boundary 2, Resilience, Environmental History, Western American Literature, and others. In all, she remains committed to anti-racist and anti-colonial knowledge production and social movements. Cassie Galantine is currently a doctoral candidate in the University of Oregon English Department. She holds a master's degree in English from Northern Arizona University. She's interested in the intersection of environmental justice, medical humanities, and critical race and ethnic studies in US literature and popular culture. Specifically, her current research examines representations of dirt, disease, and racial discourses of hygiene in 20th century multi-ethnic US women's working class literature. Dr. Shane Hall studies how relationships between racism, militarism, and climate change are represented in US literature and popular culture. He's currently working on a book about the cultural construction of environmental and climate migrants and how the figure of these migrants figures centrally in militarized narratives of climate futures. At Salisbury University, Dr. Hall teaches various courses on environmental justice, the environmental humanities, and field studies of the Chesapeake. Dr. Alexander Manriski is an assistant professor of English at the University of Connecticut. Previously, he taught in the Department of English and Communication and the Honors College at University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and the Departments of English and Writing, Rhetoric, and Digital Studies at the University of Kentucky. He's the author of Wild Abandoned, American Literature and Identity Politics of Ecology that came out in 2021 from Cambridge University Press. He's currently working on a second book project tentatively titled Everyday Eco-Fascism. And this book considers casual and systemic rather than intentional and overt expressions of white supremacist, anti-Indigenous, and anti-immigrant thinking in environmental art and politics. That sounds amazing. Can't wait to read that book. His work has also appeared or is forthcoming in Criticism, a quarterly for literature and the arts, ASLE, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and the Environment, Mosaic, GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies, Resilience, EdgeEffects magazine, and elsewhere. He also curates ASLE's teaching resources database, so I encourage you all to check that out. That is where you can download the resource they're going to be talking about today against the eco-fascist creep. It just was posted yesterday, I think. So encourage you all to download it. I got to take a quick look yesterday. It's amazing. Bruno Seraphin is a PhD candidate in sociocultural anthropology at Cornell University. His research focuses on environmental and climate justice, anti-colonial social movements, and community video production. He lives in Karuk territory in Northern California and conducts research on the intersections of wildfire policy and settler colonialism. He's a settler scholar who grew up on Nipmuc lands and also an award-winning filmmaker with a BFA in film and television from New York University. Because I feel like I have been talking for a super long time, I'm actually going to just introduce each group right before their presentation. But the last person I want to make sure to not forget is Melody Keenan, who worked also on Against the Eco-Fascist Creep as a graphic designer. And Melody is a recent graduate of San Diego State University in the graphic design and art history departments. And she's interested in the ways graphic design mirrors societal values and conventions. In her own work, she specializes in lettering and illustration that utilizes vintage aesthetics, but modern values. So please join me in welcoming the team that created Against the Eco-Fascist Creep. Cassie put in the link or in the chat a link to the zine so you can download it and take a look. And I will be quiet now and let you all talk about your project.
Hi, y'all. We're going to just kind of tag team this. So my name is Dr. April Anson, and I'm just going to do a brief introduction to the project. Cassie has dropped the link into the chat. And when you go to that link, you will see this page on ASLE's website. Gives you a little bit of a primer on the project, as well as links to download it. And we'll be taking you through the whole document as we speak. So the project really emerged from this recognition that, we're all, in one way or another, we all kind of wish for simple solutions to very complex problems when we think about climate justice and climate change in particular, and the overwhelming and persistent unwillingness of global leaders to take meaningful action. It shows up in our students, I'm sure, our colleagues, family members, and I know personally, even myself, I recognize and catch myself sometimes drifting into climate nihilism. And so, this kind of nihilistic thinking, of course, it forecloses any future as a given dystopian reality. And so this project emerged from just a kind of shared recognition that we needed some usable on the ground resources to combat that thinking in ourselves and in our communities. Unfortunately, the need for that has become even more visceral and relevant this week with the Buffalo shooting. And I am going to drop into the chat an article by a colleague or that interviews a colleague on the ways that the Buffalo mass murderers manifesto not only just plagiarized whole sections of the mass murderers in Christchurch, New Zealand, but also repeats these, not just the great replacement theory of white genocide, but also the ways that that is dovetailing very kind of frictionlessly into a climate fascism. So unfortunately, this week, the project is just, I think, powerfully relevant. But we initially began talking about this because the specter of ecofascism is just everywhere in our popular imaginations. And the ways that scholarship has kind of heretofore talked about ecofascism was necessarily incomplete. Typically, it's talked about as originating in Nazi Germany with the Green Nazis, a little bit maybe before in 19th century German Romanticism, but no acknowledgement of American influences on Nazi Germany and the ways that the kind of American environmental imagination is just absolutely threaded through this new far-right climate fascism that we're seeing. And so essentially scholarship is really unable to explain thus far these movements that we're seeing in relation to climate change. So we began thinking about a definition of ecofascism that was maybe more capacious to give us a kind of lens to understand our current moment. So we're thinking about ecofascism as a environmentalism that advocates or accepts violence and then also reinforces existing systems of power and inequality. So suggesting that certain kinds of people are naturally and exclusively entitled to control environmental resources. This is obviously a very familiar phenomenon to us in ASLE, who have long been attentive to the ways that justice is at the center of environmental concerns. But in terms of our popular imagination, I think we see eco-fascist sentiment being shared a lot more often than more nuanced attention to justice issues. So thinking about ecofascism is not just a state phenomenon, not just a past phenomenon, not just a Nazi phenomenon, but a structural environmental logic that belongs to the politics and practices of settler colonialism. So I think, one of the questions that Lisa asked us to talk about is like, what surprised us? For me personally, it was that it's just the project came out so much better than we imagined originally. And that is in large part thanks to Melody Keenan, who's here with us today. Her like vision and artistic just prowess turned the kind of intellectual project that we had developed into just a beautiful public facing document. So like, yes, she is a complete rock star and she was so flexible with the public humanities projects tend to have lots more hiccups than we can see from the beginning, right? So the other, as I turn to Bruno to take us through the first part of the document, the other piece of advice I would say is to start small, and you can always scale up and bring more resources into the project. But if you start with a really big vision, it can be really overwhelming, and we can feel like we're setting ourselves up for failure. So start small, and then when you have pipelines to more resources, then you can build out. So that, and Melody was just so central to doing that. So I'm going to drop her website in here just to to plug her work, which is just absolutely phenomenal. And then I'm going to hand it off to Bruno to take here's a little preview of Melody's portfolio to get a sense of how awesome she is. And then I'm going to hand it off to Bruno to take us through the comic portion of the zine.
Hello.
Nope, that's me.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm Bruno. Or maybe just a nod, are people seeing the Against the Fascist Creep title cover page? Cool.
You can actually do that.
I guess I could,
Yeah.
although I don't know how to work this funky mouse. How do I scroll on it?
Just one finger.
Maybe you
Click
should
on
do
it. There we go. Sorry, y'all. There we go. Now you can
Mouse
get it.
problems.
Mouse
Oh, okay.
problems.
Great. Yeah, so as we were creating a zine, a document to help ourselves and others like identify eco-fascist myths and talking points and just common sense ideas that could kind of creep toward eco-fascism potentially, you know, we wanted to have a meaty, well-researched document, but we also wanted it to be kind of fun and, you know, which might be sort of counterintuitive, but at least have a kind of interesting hook and do a little bit of pop culture critique that would have sort of a broad-based appeal, hopefully, or potentially. So the zine is kind of organized around the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and in particular, the character of Thanos. And Thanos, many people have seen these films, but not everyone has, is a central villain. He's sort of the arch supervillain of the Marvel movies, the MCU. And he appears centrally in Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame, which are two of the highest grossing films of all time. Avengers Endgame might be the single highest grossing film of all time, if not number 2. And Thanos's kind of origin story and his ideology as a villain is not named explicitly as eco-fascist in the films, but really is so. And he's drawing on tropes from really kind of foundational things to settler colonialism, to European imperialism, to eugenics. And he's sort of obsessed with population. And he kind of emerges on the scene with this ideology that all of the problems of the universe are caused by there being too many people. People are hungry because there's too many people. There's war because there's too many people. So the solution that he proposes and that he asserts only he has the will to do anything about is to commit essentially mass murder and cull and kill half of all life in the universe. So, you know, total creep, basically. And so we wanted to identify him as like an eco-fascist creep that also like the way that he got a chance to speak his ideology into the films was sort of an example of the eco-fascist creep, of eco-fascism kind of creeping into our pop culture and the way that it was sort of looming in our imaginations, in our pop culture imagination at this moment. So the first part of the zine is kind of a counter comic. It's sort of a what if, because one of the things in the films is that Thanos gets an opportunity to really give voice to his perspective. And the heroes of the film, the Avengers, really don't give any kind of voice to any alternative perspective. So it's kind of what you see in these films is essentially one of the most high profile debates on the merits of eco-fascism, where we only kind of really hear from we only sort of hear from the eco-fascist, pro-eco-fascist side of things. So we kind of thought it would be funny or interesting or an interesting hook to sort of stage that debate. Like, what would it look like if they had really talked these ideas through instead of just teaming up and beating Thanos up? I will say, I don't think the films should have necessarily had this debate. They may have been a very weird choice for a superhero movie to have an intense philosophical debate. And also, I'm not sure that, you know, engaging in, you know, very nuanced philosophical debate is the right strategy for dealing with someone like Thanos, who's completely committed to mass murder. Like sometimes when it comes to dealing with fascists, you just have to stop them. It's not about convincing them to change their perspective or something like that. So I kind of, in some ways, I'm sort of agreeing with the Avengers, like maybe it was just the right choice to just defeat him using your superpowers. And so the comic sort of starts with them sort of talking about like, well, his plan really doesn't make sense. But even Thor is sort of right at the beginning is like, we can't reason with him. He knows his plan makes no sense. But then they sort of have the conversation anyway. And just like beautifully rendered by Melody again. And so we kind of have maybe it's like Socratic kind of Thanos gives a chance to make a point. The Avengers, in addition to like, you know, fighting him, are also kind of rebutting his points as they go and kind of each, Black Panther, Ant-Man are all kind of contributing a piece to this conversation, to this like response to Thanos, the response that again never happened in the film itself. And we kind of arrived back in a way where we started, where Captain America said, I was created to fight fascists. That includes eco-fascists. Thanos, you're the fascist. You're trying to censor my beliefs. And Stark saying, well, so much for defeating Thanos in the marketplace of ideas, and snapping him away, which is basically what happens in the film. So this was kind of the intro, and we sometimes jokingly call this part like the fun part. And after that, we get into some more research and essays and really work through some of these ideas that just get hinted at in the comic portion. So yeah, and before I pass it on to our next person, I'll just add a couple things that I learned in this process. One is that it's just so great to collaborate with people, and too often as like a humanities or a social science scholar, you're just really focused on being a single author or your career, what your publication is, et cetera. And it's nice to really work together. And although working together, everything takes longer than you think it will. And that's not a bad thing. It's just something to be ready for. And it's also really fun to work on something that is fun and public facing. And it's too bad that I think like tenure structure and a lot of the academic structure that we find ourselves in doesn't always incentivize this kind of public facing work, but I think it could and it should. So yeah, with that, who am I passing it on to? It might be Alex.
I think it's me, yeah.
Right, thanks.
Should we, April, do you want to keep sharing your screen? Should we pass on the sharing? What works best?
You can just scroll as you.
Yeah, why don't we stop here? Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Alex. Now that the fun part's over, I'll get to the, not fun part, but the kind of the really substantive part of the document. I think I want to start by taking a moment to acknowledge the namesake of the zine, Against the Eco-Fascist Creep. We kind of got that title from a book, Alexander Reed Ross's Against the Fascist Creep. I think that's the full title. I think it includes the against. Reed Ross's whole point is that it's not just that like people on the far right are sort of seducing people at the center and like policies at the center to kind of like right-wing positions. It's also that kind of the way our political and economic systems work in the United States, sort of the ideas and the narratives that are motivating the far right and fascism more specifically are also motivating people on the left. Aspects of settler colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, et cetera, infuse both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, which I'm sure everybody knows. It's not just that, the right is seducing the left, it's also that fascist ideas, quote unquote, creep into what we do and what we think, because the seeds for them are already there, in kind of these traditions. Since this is a public facing document, rather than kind of present information by sort of tracing a narrative from, like the settler colonial, the earliest settler colonial encounters to the present day, and kind of tracing how settler colonial ideas, capitalist ideas are kind of influencing kind of everyday politics today, and kind of the phrase that was, I think April used, it was popular imagination, right? Or popular imagination, popular rhetoric. Rather than kind of trace that narrative, which, shout out, I believe April herself is doing in her book project. Anyway, right? Rather than do that, to make it more accessible, we presented information as sort of like 6 really common eco-fascist myths that pop up a lot in a variety of media. Again, not necessarily on the right. We're not even necessarily kind of targeting or talking about folks like the Buffalo shooter or the El Paso shooter. We're really talking about the sort of myths that pop up in writing by people in the center and on the left. April, would you mind scrolling down to the next thing, where we kind of intentionally organized these short little mini essays, these 6 myths, and we really started with one of the most frequent, probably most frequently when you kind of see eco-fascist ideas pop up in media, it's with reference to overpopulation. And so we started with the overpopulation angle, the Malthusian argument that there are just too many people and they're a drain on our resources. We also started with a figure who often pops up in writing that's really kind of implicitly eco-fascist, and that's Garrett Hardin. and his tragedy of the commons, right? You see it all over the place. You see progressive, nominally progressive environmentalists citing him favorably, as well as folks on the far right. Hardin's tragedy of the commons was basically at base, not just an apologia for private ownership of resources, but more specifically for eugenics. He himself kind of was advocating positions that not only kind of tight border control, but also sterilization of specifically of people of color and lower income populations as a way to kind of deal with the overpopulation problem, and also and save more resources for the people who already have them, essentially, right? At no point does Hardin really address the fact that most for example, most resource consumption and kind of most byproducts of extraction are kind of at the hands of the wealthy already, right? He never really touches on that. Our third kind of myth is kind of a little bit broader, because this is something that pops up all over the place. You see it in writing by deep ecologists. You see it to reference April, April kind of drew attention in an essay to the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, when people referred to nature healing, right? Because people were dying, right? And that's kind of an eco-fascist idea in itself, right? The idea that humans are the virus. And in the early days of the COVID pandemic, that's a pretty old idea too. But we're really in these essays kind of focusing on what are the kind of talking points that we see a lot. Rather than tracing an historical narrative, we start with the talking points and then we kind of debunk them one by one, often with reference to that history. But we're really focused on the talking points and offering alternatives to them. And I think I'm passing it on to maybe Shane next, maybe Cassie, I'm not sure who, but I know, if we're reflecting on what the experience was like. Basically, I mean, what I had planned to say was basically what Bruno did. What really struck me about this experience was just, well, from I'm as Lisa mentioned, I'm working on a book about what I'm calling everyday ecofascism, and ecofascism is such a hard thing to define. Just like fascism itself, but working in a group of people who are thinking about similar questions and having the space to do that has really helped me with my own work and defining it. And Bruno's entirely right. We often, just based on the way the system works, are kind of corralled into little units where we're working alone so often. And it's hard, especially in a department where you might be the only person in a graduate program working on a specific idea. It's hard to find other people around you to really bounce ideas off of and kind of hone what you're thinking about. So working on this sort of project was a really great idea to help me understand the world better. And also just in general, there haven't been a lot of opportunities for collaboration, especially in the last few years. And this is just an excellent way for us to be able to make knowledge together and to share it with people, which is often something we don't have the opportunity to do, unfortunately, in the way the university is structured. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to whoever is next.
I think it's me, Alex. And that's just a very beautiful thing to say, Alex, about I think we were all drawn to this in a lot of ways because of the lack of collaboration over the last couple of years, especially. So I upsparkle that. So I'm going to talk about the next three essays, but really just to give a quick sense and to move us along here. The essays sort of follow an arc, if you will. And the first three that Alex was just walking us through speak to the ways that ecofascism universalizes human degradation of environment and sort of blame for environmental things. And so the problem is humans themselves by nature need to be controlled by a militarized strongman and his secret police or whatever. That's like fascism 101. The second set of the fourth and fifth essays, city people are the problem and strong borders protect our scarce resources, look at the other tendency within all forms of fascist thought, which is to specifically otherize subgroups of a population, demonize them, control them, surveil them, and ultimately kill them and otherwise harm them. So we used intentionally two really common threads that we see throughout tons of academic scholarship of looking at how both eco-fascists, but also sort of everyday environmentalists for a long time in the American and European traditions, if you have that Venn diagram of straight up eco-fascists and everyday environmentalists, a lot of anti-urban and anti-migrant sentiment runs throughout those. And of course, those are ostensibly colorblind terms, but in these contexts, they are always already racialized against people of color, against indigenous people as a racialized conception. And so those are what those two essays are pointedly debunking, those particular ways that fascism otherizes particular groups of people, not just people as a whole. And the final essay, Environmental and Social Collapse Are Desirable, looks at, I think, what April was speaking to at the beginning of our talk here, of that sort of desire to, that fascism also, as an affect, if you will, operates under this desire to have the onus of agency and work taken off of the very put upon population and given to someone who is better, stronger, wiser, rational, tough guy who's gonna take care of us and take the thing off. And in a way, whether you give that to a dictator or you give that to, oh, once things collapse, it'll organically grow back better, is that same move of giving up our agency and responsibility to act in service of climate justice, and instead saying, well, I hope when everything collapses, it comes back better. And that's not what we have any historical evidence suggesting that happened. So that's sort of, I think, one of the most subtle eco-fascist myths that we take up in this project here. So that's sort of the arc of the essays as a whole, goes from universalizing humans as the problem to what specific humans does eco-fascism think are the problem, to our hope for somebody else taking care of all of our problems is also a problem. And I'm handing our final comments off to Cassie, but I'll just say, as my lesson learned, I would say us all running over time right now is a lesson learned of how, when you get a bunch of people together, it does take longer, and we are not well trained in the humanities to work in groups. Like, we all want, our stamp, and so when you wordsmith something with 6 authors or 5 authors, and that's really tough. And I think what I'm trying to learn is how to understand my role as someone who didn't the fun part, the comic, the idea of Thanos, that's Bruno, and April's book project. The vision is amazing. I think my role throughout a lot of this was really trying to keep language open and public, and massaging the text of those things a lot more. And it's good to have a role where I'm just not, again, this is not my book. And that's something that we in grad school are not trained to do, of this is not my thing. This is not my original syllabus for my class. So I think that's something that I really am going to keep thinking about as I move forward in other projects with other collaborators, or with the same collaborators again, which I would totally do.
So I'll close us out with our section on tactics and strategies going forward. I'm not going to go through each of them in detail just for time's sake, but I think one of the most important things to highlight here is the third bullet point, the support land back, as we all are probably very well aware. Because of the structure of eco-fascist discourse and the way that it comes about and who it targets, Indigenous peoples have always already been opposed, have been fighting this type of activity, this type of discourse. And so looking to things like land back and supporting land back is one of the most important things that we can do to fight eco-fascism today, especially because, as we note, Indigenous peoples comprise 5% of the population, but protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. So, and we know that, not everybody contributes to climate catastrophe equally, that it's not necessarily it's very easy. Even some of our eco-fascist myths tend to dip into the territory of falling into the trap of neoliberalism and focusing on individual actions. And a lot of our calls to action try to target larger systemic change through things like land back and through things like abolishing borders, or working towards that goal of decriminalizing and eventually, hopefully, getting rid of borders. and holding things like the U.S. military accountable for the fact that they're one of the largest polluters, and so that's kind of the framework for a lot of our structural approaches to this. And then also just, in everyday conversation, if you are in the position to and have the safety to call out this discourse, that's super important. And we're hoping this resource can help folks with that and also be a good teaching resource for folks to bring into the classroom. I could see it being super helpful both in a writing classroom and in a lit classroom and a film classroom, which is kind of the zone I'm thinking of teaching in. So I feel like the possibilities are kind of endless with this. And then in terms of my experience on this project, so my favorite work that I've done, my favorite publications, both peer reviewed and non-peer reviewed, have been my collaborative projects, because I really do enjoy working with others, and I just have learned so much from all of my co-writers and co-collaborators. And I will say, probably two pieces of advice I would have is I have a tough time trusting that any of my ideas are worth putting formally in a Google Doc. I always put myself in suggesting mode or put as a comment because I'm I don't know if it's good. I'm just a lowly grad student. And I'm learning that actually makes more work for people. And it's actually can be very frustrating for others. So trust your instincts, and contribute as you would, as any of the other members would. And then, people will tell you if things need to be edited. And then the other piece of advice that I think I have is we, particularly given the subject matter of this and its public facing nature, set up an email address that wasn't linked, wasn't any of our personal email addresses, to field feedback and potentially hate mail that we may get. So that can be a really useful tactic. Obviously, our names are still on it, but I think that might reduce some of those emails coming to our work accounts or our personal accounts. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to spend more time with that document. Thanks so much for sharing it with us, and congratulations on it launching. So we're going to learn next about Exile to Motown from Dr. Mika Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy is currently a visiting assistant professor of English at Kalamazoo College, where she teaches courses in 20th and 21st century multi-ethnic US and environmental literatures. In fall 2022, she's going to be joining Ithaca College as assistant professor of Asian American Studies. Her current academic book project examines narratives of Japanese American incarceration and the ways these narratives are in conversation with questions about the environment, the seductions of the frontier, and Indigenous sovereignty. And for the past several years, she's also been the co-curator of the Japanese American Citizens League Detroit chapter's grassroots museum exhibit titled Exile to Motown, which we're going to learn more about. And this exhibit brings to life the history of the Japanese American community in Metro Detroit. So Mika, I will pass it off to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Lisa. While I go ahead and have these slides load, I wanted to thank the group that went before me with Against the Eco-Fascist Creep. Completely fascinating and also really helpful in setting up my presentation, because that means I don't have to do all the legwork that they already did in terms of priming you for things to think about. So that is always excellent when you're the person going second after an excellent presentation. And so I wanted to start off by flagging the fact that this presentation or this project probably is the least obvious environmental humanities project of these in terms of its taking place or focused on an urban environment and doesn't necessarily talk about the kind of ecology of this environment, but it is very much rooted in place and thinking about ways that we, particularly as scholars, kind of live and work in place. And this project originated, as far as my involvement in it, out of a desire to think through what it meant to be doing graduate work in the state of Michigan on a project that was situated elsewhere in the American West. And so being in one place and looking out towards another. And what I really wanted to do, in addition to the kind of PhD, whatever research that I was doing while in Michigan, is also to think about what my responsibility then was to the place where I actually was and what connections I might make between my research and the desires and communities happening kind of all around me. And so this project is not mine. The history of Japanese America pre-exists my existence by about 100 years. And I've also only been in the state of Michigan since 2013. And a lot of the work for Exile to Motown as a museum exhibit happened between 1996 and 2014. And I will be talking about the 2015 through present day portion of this project. But really, it is a project that belongs to the Japanese American Citizens League Detroit chapter and Japanese Americans who might not be affiliated with that organization. And to kind of talk a little bit more about what that exactly means is this project is talking through the history of the development of a Japanese American community in Metro Detroit, which is not something people historically associate with the city of Detroit or even the Midwest in terms of there being a visible Asian American population oftentimes. And it was also really invested in thinking about something that is often contained within this rubric of Japanese American history or World War II history, and thinking about the ways that it exceeds those sort of temporal or topical boundaries and also becomes very much a history of place, a history of being in relation to the city of Detroit and its own larger histories of removal, racialized violence, and policing. And so to talk a little bit about how the most recent version of this exhibit came to be is that piece that it pre-existed me was really a project on behalf of the JACL Detroit chapter to collect oral histories and self-publish them in a book also titled Exile to Motown. And where I came into this project was being a member of the JACL Detroit chapter and asking sort of, what do we want to do next with this thing? Where do we want to take it? And the chapter really wanted not only to share it with its own members, which was its primary circulation up to that point, but also the broader community so that people could know these stories, people could know this history, and it wouldn't just be something that Japanese Americans were interested in because they were Japanese American. And so really to make it something that was everyone's history and everyone's thing to think about in relation to whatever their positionality might be in terms of the city of Detroit or the region of Metro Detroit. And so there were a couple of different stages. We did a smaller traveling exhibit prior to partnering with the Detroit Historical Museum and their community gallery to stage a larger exhibit that brought in more material objects and collected additional object-oriented oral histories to continue this project. And because we were at the Detroit Historical Museum, one of the things that was really important in terms of framing this narrative and kind of pushing people to consider these connections was to think about what it means for this to not be a history of World War II or Japanese American incarceration, but specifically Japanese Americans in Detroit. And so as far as my work on this project goes, a lot of it was narrative-based, both writing and graphic design, and thinking about how to bring a book of oral histories that do not have the vocal recordings any longer due to problems, technical glitches, and to bring them to a museum space so that they could be enjoyed and engaged with. And so thinking about how a book might look on a wall, or thinking about what oral histories we could conduct anew that could help tell that story, or thinking about how to take a ledger of names and places and to put that into a form that people could intake visually. So on the right side of the screen, we have the population of Japanese Americans in the Metro Detroit area over time. This is one of 6 different maps that sort of maps that between 1946 and 1997. We didn't go later than that because it felt a little bit creepy to be talking about where people were living, still living. And so as far as the exhibit itself, this was probably one of the most gratifying parts of the project in terms of really being able to engage with the Detroit Historical Museum and to think about how the project could be augmented by their expertise kind of as well as ours in terms of making sure that our graphic design was within the parameters, within the museum's parameters for accessibilities, in terms of thinking about how we can best use this space and really bring people into this narrative as they walk through the exhibit. Because this project happened or was supposed to happen in June of 2020, it also meant that we had a decent period of time where everything was closed and we were not indeed putting on a physical museum exhibit. And so part of the programming for this exhibit in order to share with the greatest number of people also became digital. You can go to xl.motown.org if you want to see our website. But we worked really hard to partner with as many different kind of outlets as possible in order to put this story in as many different forms as possible, whether that be the Detroit Public Television to have a spot that would air on PBS, whether that be articles or podcasts or other types of videos, and also to be able to share with people who were unable to come to the museum or indeed existed or were living outside of the Metro Detroit area. As far as a challenge goes, this was challenging in that neither me nor my co-curator are super excited about talking to people in public, and also didn't necessarily feel that we wanted to be the face of this thing so that people would associate it with us or have it be our project. We also have very little buy-in for people who wanted to be on camera, because it turns out no one in the JACL Detroit chapter wants to be on camera. So that's a challenge. I always find people who are excited to ham it up for a television crew. But as far as these connections, one of the things we wanted to make really clear in this exhibit was thinking about Detroit as a place that throughout its entire history has had histories of forced removal and forced coming in the case of Japanese Americans incarcerated in the West. And so one of the things that we added in the Detroit Historical Museum version was a big 54-foot timeline that speaks to the history of Detroit as a place. At the top in the center has the history of Japanese Americans in Detroit, and is also thinking about that history in relation to Asian American history nationally, and to invite people to think about these connections rather than the isolation of it being a World War II story. This, of course, also lends itself to thinking about race in Detroit and how an Asian American population is in conversation with the often stark white-black kind of designations of space in the city, as well as thinking about what it means to be Japanese American, whether that means kind of objects that are heirlooms passed down from Japan as objects kind of an immigration experience, or whether that means things that were created while in Detroit, and thinking about many community members who are like, oh, I don't really have anything Japanese, and to get them to understand that their history, regardless of its relation to having been able to carry these objects from Japan, is still Japanese American, such as this dress that was made in Detroit and passed down from generations to be the prom dress for multiple different women. It was also important for us to think about Detroit as, or the Metro Detroit area, in this case Dearborn, as being one of the largest Arab American and Muslim American populations, and to think about how that impacts the way we think about Asian American history in the area. And I think one of the biggest surprises was the buy-in from the community in terms of the invitations that we offered them for engaging with the exhibit and thinking about their own place in this exhibit. And so one of the things that we had was a station for being able to fold cranes as part of an organization called Suru for Solidarity. We also asked them what solidarity looked like to them, and we got probably hundreds of Post-it notes that expressed that in various different ways from all kinds of different people who came to see the exhibit. And so that was really gratifying to see that people were taking that invitation and really running with it. It was also really excellent to be able to understand these stories as things that were continuous and ever ongoing. And so we had people who would come to the museum and be able to offer us information that we didn't have. For instance, the fact that the person that Nobshi Makochi in this photo on the left was staying next to is indeed his father. We had Nobshi Makochi's daughter let us know that, and we were able to make that connection. We were also able to be in contact with Linda Fukuda, who does not live in Metro Detroit any longer, but heard about the exhibit and was asking if we had heard anything about the dance that she had done as a teenager living in Metro Detroit. And we were happy to be able to say, not only did we know that, but we had photographs that we could share with her and send to her that she didn't already have in her possession. And so be able to have that reciprocity and that kind of awakening of these narratives was really wonderful. As far as additional challenges for this project, I think definitely thinking about what the other group said was these questions of scale and how much buy-in was available, because a lot of the work for this project was done by people who were not us, but at a time prior to this exhibit. And so all of the writing and all of the graphic design and all histories did kind of fall on us. And it felt a little bit scary, because oftentimes you would ask for feedback and people would be like, oh, it's fine. And you could never tell whether that meant it actually was fine and they liked it, or if they just didn't want to tell you. And so really trying to build those relationships and those lines of communication was probably one of the hardest parts of this project. Even as, of course, the depth of participation from all of our people who lended objects and who also kind of responded and sent us emails, sent us photographs as a result of this project was one of the best things about it. As far as closing advice from this experience, I think probably the number one thing that I am taking from this experience is to recognize the level of commitment that it takes to put together a public humanities project, because you are responsible to someone other than yourself. If you don't write that article for a journal, no one's going to notice, no one's going to care except maybe the editor. But if you don't follow through on a community project, then you're letting down that community. And so you need to be really prepared to, know what you're getting into, because there's people who are writing on this project that are not yourself, right? And that's not something that is true in that same way for a lot of academic work. Like, if you don't turn in your dissertation chapter to your professor, your advisor at a certain time, they probably are not even going to remember that that deadline was a thing. But the museum will notice. The people hoping to see your exhibit will notice. And I would also urge people to think about scaffolding, because again, like the first group talked about, these projects happen on a long timeline. And in order for it to be most valuable to a community, it behooves you to think about ways you can introduce pieces of it prior to being fully completed, whether that means hosting an online talk, or whether that means maybe having a smaller version of it, so that you can continue to grow that project, in terms of what they were talking about with regard to scale, right? And being able to scale up something and to start small and have those building blocks kind of laid out for you or have them in mind. And also to think about the futurity of your project and what sorts of networks you can bring it to in the future, what happens once that initial project is done, where it goes, whether that means to new audiences or whether that means literally. So the exhibit is currently right there in my living room, but we're working on getting it put someplace more accessible at the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan, where anyone can go and check out those materials. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I'm excited to hear from the rest.
Thank you, Mika. That was really wonderful. I might be hitting you up later with some questions via email, but that was really, really helpful. Next up, I want to introduce the team that worked on Storing Extinction, responding to the loss of North Idaho's mountain caribou. Today, we have with us Kredell. I'm sorry, I actually never asked how to pronounce your last name. Is that correct? Okay, great. Jack is a PhD student in environmental science at the University of Idaho's College of Natural Resources, and his areas of interest include environmental history and settler ecological relationships, critical animal studies, climate change, and geospatial narrative. He's currently at work on several GIS-based archival projects that use collaborative storytelling to document and explore environmental change within Idaho and the Western United States. And his partner on this project, who's unable to join us today because he's in the field and off the grid, is Chris Lamb, a recent graduate of the English MA program at the University of Idaho, where he focused on studies of literature in the environment and environmental humanities more broadly. And Chris's research interests include the philosophies of space, environmental ethics, extinction studies, critical cartography, digital humanities, and environmental justice. And he currently lives in Corvallis, Oregon. So Jack, really excited to hear about your project. I'll hand things off to you.
Great, thank you. Okay, is that good?
Yeah, looks good from here.
Okay, yeah, so the project is called Storing Extinction, Responding to the Loss of North Idaho's Mountain Caribou. And this image, which is on the landing page of our project, which is a web-based map, essentially, was taken from a helicopter in the 80s as it swooped down to net this group of caribou. And for relocation programs, there's usually what's called a mugger and a gunner. And the gunner shoots the net at the caribou, and then the mugger jumps out of the helicopter and kind of wraps the net around one or two or three of these caribou. And the idea here is basically to implicate the user in this longer history and practice of colonial slow violence, which in the first and last instance is the reason why caribou are no longer in North Idaho. And so while this is a project about coming to terms with caribou, exploring their absence, it's not one in which you can glimpse caribou directly. It's not as innocent as that, at least I hope. Oops. So I thought it'd be useful to talk about caribou for a second. A mountain caribou is a large charismatic ungulate, and they are unique in that they are mountain adapted. They are grouped or understood by the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, as a distinct population segment or an ecotype. And both of these terms are basically the same as subspecies. And basically they were listed in 1983 by actually a local goat rancher who drew up the first petition. And then in 2019, they were declared extirpated from the Idaho Panhandle. Their population had been limited to the South Selkirk Range, which is a kind of narrow, spiny, craggy mountain range in the north of Idaho that terminates at the northern end of Lake Pend Oreille and then extends past the Canadian border way up into BC. And these caribou are extremely unique in that they migrate vertically instead of horizontally across the landscape. And so during winter, most ungulates come down from the mountains and then they situate themselves in the valleys where the snowpack isn't very high, and they browse or graze. At that moment, caribou are going up country to the high country. And what they do is they wait in these old growth cedar hemlock groves that kind of prevent the snowpack from forming in mid elevations. And then in winter, when that snowpack sets up, they start heading for the high country. And they use that snowpack, which is up to 15 feet deep in the Selkirks, to lift themselves into the base of these old growth Engelmann spruces and subalpine firs to browse the lichen that collects in their branches. And they live entirely off lichen for about 6 months of the year. And this is a strategy to basically insulate themselves from predators. Predators can't cross that snowpack barrier, essentially. Locally and in Canada, they are known as the gray ghost, which is a name I've always really loved. Okay, so just a second. When Chris and I were in grad school at University of Idaho here in Moscow, in 2019, we started the English master's program in 2019. Earlier that year, it was announced in the New York Times and in several other publications that Caribou had been declared extirpated. The last 3 Idaho ranging female caribou were airlifted and taken to a captive breeding facility in BC. And so they were functionally extinct. There was no longer a viable population or hope of one. And initially, I was really fascinated by this question of how the memory of caribou might persist in the physical environment. Could we go up there and find a shed or walk a caribou migration corridor or look for a tree rub? This set of questions still fascinates me, but it's not one that I think is really interesting or beneficial to answer. I mean, maybe to me it is, but maybe not to the local community or to the general public. And then we read Lively Ethography by Tom Van Doren and Deborah Bird Rose in our Environmental Humanities seminar with Scott Slovic, who is an eco-critic. And I guess it changed my sense of story. I realized that a story and even a human memory could be considered part of the material environment. And I became obsessed with the idea of the caribou that is contained in somebody's head walking around North Idaho right now, or going to the grocery store in Bonners Ferry. I knew that there were people out there who had encounters with mountain caribou when they were still here in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And just that these people were now in their own environments, and we just had to somehow seek them out. And we also had to come up with a way to represent these stories when we did collect them. And so the second set of questions became, how is this event, this fissure or this local extinction, negotiated, processed, forgotten, imagined, and storied by the local human and non-human communities in and around North Idaho? And so we began writing grants. We were mostly unsuccessful, but then our own library's Center for Digital Inquiry and Learning gave us $3,900 to do the project. And we proposed producing what's called a deep map, a digital deep map. And this term was first coined by an Osage American author named William Least Heat Moon in Prairie Earth, which is a text-based narrative, but it's a really wonderful personal phenomenology of Chase County in Kansas. And basically he personally drove there and just lived there, walked around the town, interviewed people, collected archival materials, and then produced this amazingly thick and rich textual narrative that contained all of these things, and that was fundamentally cross-disciplinary. And I basically wanted to do the same thing with GIS technology, which is essentially a way to layer content. And I thought this would be very germane to letting others tell their stories, because I think a community is a collection of diverse individuals, and I think that this merits a kind of diverse form to accommodate these different perspectives. And then we began the process of simultaneously building the website with the help from CDIL and going into the field to collect these oral history stories while also trying to do our coursework and everything else. And it was nightmarish, but it was a labor of love. And I just want to echo something that people have been saying, and that this is not my project. It was co-produced between myself, Chris Lamb, and the Center and the CDIL, and all of these people are essential to it. And it's just like not reducible to any one person anymore. And Chris and I submitted this jointly as our master's theses, actually, and we had to really fight the dean for this because no one had tried to submit a website before. Let alone a co-authored thesis, and so it was a struggle, but we got it done. So yeah, I wish I had put the link in the chat, but maybe it's available, because I encourage you to just mess around with it, try and break it, get lost in it. It's really built to be played with and explored as one would a physical space. So in the end, we collected 33 oral history videos. Not all of those are unique. There are probably 15 unique subjects, and then we were able to get numerous videos from certain people. And 750 remote camera images, 2 long-form nonfiction narratives that were written by myself and Chris about our experiences producing this thing. Mine is called Valleys, his is called Mountains. His is about our immersion in the former habitat, in the physical environment, in Caribou ruins. Mine is about the valleys, where we collected people's stories, we interacted with different communities. Yeah, and all of this together is the map. And again, I think maps are fascinating because they led the way to colonial extraction. They show colonial holdings, private property, mines. They contain roads. They show us, they push us through space, and they prescribe degrees of freedom, but they don't show us what space is actually like in terms of its qualia. And this is why maps for us are really interesting sites of production and creativity and critique. I just want to show you an example of an oral history video. And what we would do is we would collect it, film it, and then we would what's called geo-reference it, where the story or the encounter actually took place. And often we would try to film people in the location where they saw the caribou, but most people who saw caribou are now old, and it's hard for us all to hike there with them in the gear. But this is Bob, and Bob's a little hard to hear because of a condition called laryngeal dystonia, but just try.
On one case, I took a hike up to Chimney Rock. I'd say it was either 93, maybe up to 95, somewhere in there. And when I went up over this ridge, open rock field, which you can see like right in here, came down, I was walking down, and then the caribou stood up. Well, the people told me about being careful with the encounters with the different animals that could charge you. And I said, well, they never told me about this, what this could do. So I stood there and looked for an area where I could dive under the rocks to protect myself. Got my camera out, started taking pictures. And the caribou got up and it walked around me just like this. And it got closer and closer as it walked. When it got here, I believe it got the smell of me with the wind blowing. And then it just walked off. So that was my day that I got to see a caribou. And I've been hiking ever since because the biggest thrill ever since I've been hiking here.
So I'll just run through the end of my presentation. I feel like I don't have much time, or I've been talking for too long. Challenges, $3,900 split between 2 grad students on $15,000 a year is really hard to produce a project with. We couldn't afford a DSLR. We just borrowed one and spent the money on gas and food basically. And we tallied 2,750 miles all over North Idaho. The other major difficulty was accessing Caribou country. It's extremely rugged, and there are grizzly bears, and sleeping with them is a challenge. But it's part of their space and the space that they once inhabited. And the other major challenge was kind of learning how to garner participation and to meet people halfway. And COVID-19 made this really difficult. And if there's one thing that we're unsatisfied with, it's that we lost the ability to include the Chinaha or the Kootenai perspective. We had been negotiating with them for about a year. We sent a proposal, and then they finally granted us access to sit with a few of the tribal elders who also helped in the relocation program or the conservation program. And then, so yeah, amazingly, we got access to film a few of the elders at tribal council. And then a week later, COVID just blew up and it was shut down. But that's okay, because the project is fundamentally open-ended. It's about our relationship to Caribou and to the environment, which can take very different forms. And I feel like as long as we take the perspective that it's always a negotiation, our material and imagined relationship to the environment, that we can find our way back in and kind of renegotiate the terms and get their perspective onto the map. Another thing we don't have are the people who didn't want Caribou there, period. These were mostly snowmobilers. This is a major reason why the federal government couldn't get true protection for Caribou. The critical habitat designated by the ESA is actually quite small. It's only 35,000 acres. They were looking for 350,000 acres, but recreationalists, but primarily snowmobilers kind of shut that door. And we want to get their perspective too. We want to know why they don't want Caribou on the landscape. Just a few surprises. I'll just focus on collaboration. I didn't know how to collaborate before this, and it became something that I now search for in my own scholarly work. I prefer it. I prefer working with people who are much better at stuff than I am, because that's where collaboration takes place. By working and understanding your own limitations and inviting people with expert knowledge in other fields in, and then kind of co-producing something together. And it also included strange and wonderful things like going to a stranger's cabin in the woods and him showing us the head of a caribou that he had in his basement, which is a story that you can read about on the map, because it's too long and crazy to get into. Final advice: diving within, jumping into space, immersing yourself in different epistemologies, learning ecology or learning caribou ecology, to talk to field biologists who they didn't really want to talk to us about the program, which was ultimately a failure because it's hard talking about Caribou without the science in a way. And so when I read and learned the science, and then I was kind of able to tease their own perspectives out better because I had adopted their language. And yeah, Chris and I think that there isn't really anything more valuable than creating space for other people to tell stories. And that's the primary goal of this project. And that's just a screenshot of all of the different storytellers and collaborators on this project. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Jack. I just want to apologize to everyone that we're running over, and hopefully you can stick around. I'm going to quickly move over to Celeste. Hopefully, I don't know how long you can stay, Celeste, but I just want to invite you to not rush through your presentation if you are able to do that, and hopefully folks can stay and we can have some Q&A because that's a really important part of the workshop. So I'm going to be quiet and let you take over, Celeste. But actually, quickly, I want to introduce you. Celeste is going to be talking about Public Humanities project, Queens of Insect Purgatory, a play reading and panel discussion with the Woodland Park Zoo. Celeste Mari Williams is a playwright and a TV animation professional transitioning to a career in conservation. Her ability to communicate and collaborate with people across multiple disciplines champions inclusion, respect, and equity. And Celeste's projects have interwoven art, science, and social justice to cultivate empathy and emotional connection with humans and wildlife. She has engaged audiences with her recent plays and multimedia projects, which drew parallels between the language and perceptions of invasive species and demonizing rhetoric against historically excluded communities. Thank you so much, Celeste, for joining us. You're muted still.
Thank you for that reminder. Okay, so for this project, I hosted an event via Zoom called Who Are You Calling Invasive last spring of 2021. So as Lisa mentioned, this included a multidisciplinary panel discussion followed by a live play reading of Queens of Insect Purgatory. The play was performed by actors of Asian descent who gave voice, perspective, and humor to invasive insects. For this project, I used theater as a creative tool to foster engagement in critical thinking and spark conversation. In addition to the cast, the event included 6 panelists with diverse expertise in disciplines, including environmental science, cultural anthropology, conservation, entomology, and community outreach. In fact, Lisa Fink was one of my panelists, and I'm excited that she's here and facilitating this event. So next slide. So a little bit of context and inspiration. At the time of this event, I was in my second year of pursuing my MA in biology. The core tenets of this program were inquiry, voice, and community. A lot of the academic research I'd been doing was investigating language frequently used in the media and conservation describing so-called invasive species. I was kind of troubled by the usage of war metaphors, good, bad, and us versus them dichotomies, and words that personified species as if they're intentionally doing harm. Oops, there we go. So I was also a communications intern with the Woodland Park Zoo, as Lisa mentioned, and one of my tasks was to write content for the zoo's spring pollinator campaign that aimed to promote positive attitudes towards insects such as bees, wasps, moths, and beetles. And so during this internship, I interviewed entomologists and conservation professionals about perceptions of insects, particularly those considered invasive, like Asian giant hornets. Oops, I just meant to Here we go. These are just a couple examples of some of the species. So a little bit more of context, talking more about these hornets from Asia. So the demonizing language around Asian giant hornets, or so-called murder hornets, had fueled the fire of negative perceptions of pathogens, wildlife, and humans associated with those of Asian descent during COVID-19. These negative perceptions of unwelcome insects paralleled the recent and historical dehumanization of people of Asian heritage as pests and vermin to be eradicated. Additionally, this apocalyptic sensationalism around Asian giant hornets caused fear and panic, leading a lot of people to randomly kill beneficial insects. So a little bit of a personal note, as many know, that there was a huge rise of anti-Asian hate during COVID-19. Fear, disgust, and xenophobia were fueled by inflammatory rhetoric from the former president, who demonized the pathogen from China. By labeling COVID as the China virus and Kung flu, it fostered a negative association between this disease and these, quote, foreign enemies who are to blame. This reminded me of invasion rhetoric and propaganda towards communities of Asian descent who have been historically demonized in the media and political cartoons as carriers of pestilence and disease, and scapegoated as threats to public health. Dehumanization, dehumanizing rhetoric, fear-mongering, and negative portrayals justified the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, as well as the Executive Order 9066 that forced Americans with Japanese ancestry into incarceration camps during World War II. So this is Queens of Insect Purgatory, the play that I wrote. The goal of this play was to give voice to Asian giant hornets and Japanese beetles, who are often demonized by humans as invasive species. I wanted to juxtapose this with European honeybees, who tend to be appreciated for their products, even though they are also a non-native species. We are so short on time. I was going to show a quick excerpt, but I think I'm going to skip that. Oops, here we go. So the goal of this event was to create an open conversation about the social impacts of language in a safe space that welcomed perspectives from multiple disciplines and culturally diverse communities. This event succeeded with utilizing theater as a creative tool of engagement and inquiry by using Asian giant hornets as a springboard for discussion of this value-laden and militaristic language around invasive insects. I encouraged engaging, collaborative, and respectful dialogue where people felt seen and heard, particularly those who have been historically excluded. And given the climate of racism and violence against those of Asian descent, I intentionally invited Asian and mixed Asian women to be part of this conversation and play reading. So I was pleased by the overall positive response to the play. It was clear that the panelists, actors, and audience were able to see and reflect upon the impact of language of invasive insects and have this juxtaposed with an all Asian American cast. The play succeeded with increasing awareness and evoking empathy, leading to emotional connection and sensitivity. As some of the panelists and actors of Asian descent felt safe enough to share their painful, visceral responses to the language of the play and noted the parallels between invasive insects and xenophobic language that was unfortunately all too familiar. I was excited actually that Erin, the entomologist, acknowledged how much she enjoyed that the play showed perspectives of insects while being scientifically accurate. And the actors and audience members also shared how much they liked learning about these specific species, as well as the social connections of language of the other. I felt this event effectively bridged theater science and social justice. Oops, I went back again. So some challenges. So given the timing of April 2021, all live theater productions were still being canceled, due to COVID mandates and safety precautions. And so while this was devastating for the industry and sad for actors who had lost out on projects, I kind of benefited because I had these very talented actors who were available to be part of my cast, and they were excited to be part of this Zoom play and discussion. So actually the virtual format of Zoom meant greater accessibility for audiences from all over the US. Okay, I keep double clicking. Okay, here we go. Almost done. So just a few words of advice for anyone seeking to do a future project in public humanities. I believe that we should seek a variety of perspectives and voices, collaborate, build relationships, and create conversations with people from multiple disciplines, including the arts, sciences, and humanities, and have diverse racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds and perspectives. And I believe that we should foster voice and leadership for individuals from historically excluded communities. And that is it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Celeste. Thanks, everyone. I hope all of these examples have really kind of the aim was to show you all the, the great variety of public humanities projects that are out there, and that, the ways, that you could potentially develop, and to really focus on interdisciplinarity. So I'm going to allow participants to unmute yourselves. Thanks to all who kind of hung in there with us, even though we're over time. I apologize for that. I was hoping to have a large chunk of time for the Q&A, but if you have any questions, I have some prepared, but I wanted to just immediately go to the participants. You can put your questions in the chat, or you can feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on people who have questions. Any questions from the audience? All right, so I'll just throw out a question, and then hopefully the audience can be maybe thinking of additional questions. I'm really interested in the formats that you chose. So we have a wide variety of formats, like a public event, digital projects, zine. What were the advantages or disadvantages of your formats? And maybe why did you choose them?
Sorry. Go.
The classic Sue moment. It's like, oh no, there is silence. Should we go? I'll go ahead and start us off. In terms of choosing to do a museum exhibit, I think one of the challenges of that format is that museums sort of have this history of being colonial institutions, and to think about what that means to put a community exhibit in a space that maybe has a somewhat conflicted relationship to the space where it exists. Something that we felt really good about was the existence of the community gallery and the Detroit Historical Museum's real investment in trying to make sure that exhibits that were coming into that gallery had as much leeway in terms of the story that they wanted to tell and the perspective that they wanted to offer. And we also talked to Suwapra Anila at the Detroit Institute of Arts around how she negotiates working for an institution that can often repeat these sort of colonial logics in terms of its collections, in terms of the way that it exists within the community. But we ultimately wanted to do it because we wanted it to be in the city of Detroit. We wanted it to be in place in as much as it also existed in the virtual world and elsewhere. So that was really kind of the primary impetus for having it be in place and having it be something that the Japanese American community and the Detroit JCL chapter wanted to see. The Detroit JCL chapter is fairly elderly, and so their interest in a Zoom talk or a virtual exhibit was essentially zero, but their interest in being able to go to a museum and see these stories in three-dimensional space was very high. So thinking about sort of what mediums will attract what audiences went into that for sure.
Cassie, were you going to add something about the format?
Yeah, I was just going to say that for us, I think, and fellow co-writers, feel free to chime in or correct me, but we had a lot of conversations about distributability, like how easily our project would be able to be printed or shared online. So that guided a lot of our decisions. And we, made a lot of color choices and things like that based on what we were hoping was something that could easily be sent out, whether it be in hard copy form or electronically. So that's like kind of some of the logistics stuff. So I'll just say that. I know my co-writers probably have more stuff to say on that, but.
We actually cycled through a lot of ideas about medium, some of which I believe are still on the table. We had discussed kind of a series of Instagram posts, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Alakveid Menon, the queer activist, but they often post they do like book reviews with kind of a series of slides with kind of a quick and dirty like summary of to put it in the terms that our resource does, kind of debunks some myth about, gender, sexuality, or what have you. And we had talked about doing something like that, that could be easily kind of distributable through social media, especially since one of our goals for the project was as a teaching resource to get it out to students at a variety of educational levels. And I think it's not necessarily something we abandoned. It's something that we said, well, let's get the zine out there, and then we can kind of revisit the question to kind of distribute the product in other forms. If I remember correctly, actually, the idea for a zine came from the fact that Bruno had already jokingly laid out a dialogue among the Avengers characters, and we kind of because most of us had seen it and had talked about how it's great that this villain is an eco-fascist to kind of foreground the villainy of eco-fascism. Not so great that the film completely chooses to not address it or offer any kind of alternative environmental vision. So I think we kind of took that and ran with it and kind of built from there. But I think that from the beginning, we always envisioned it as a multimodal project. And I think looking ahead to the future, it still very much is. We're still kind of thinking through how can we disseminate what we've put together in a variety of modes for a few different audiences.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to Jillian's question.
Hey, thanks everybody for your work. I don't know if it's a question or a comment or a comment and then a question, but when everyone was talking, I was kind of thinking about one thread that I noticed is agency or autonomy kind of. And I think one issue that we can all agree that the Academy has is doing a lot of work about people and not really giving it back to them, even though it's about them. And so much of your projects, I think, really get to that, like how to return the work back to these communities. So that was great. I loved that. And if you were kind of thinking about that, I'm thinking like the zine project, but I'm also thinking like Mika's project. Anyway, if you could speak to that if you wanted to. If not, I just wanted to say thank you for that.
I'll say something quickly about that. Our website runs on data, but I didn't want to have the speakers and the stories be reduced to data in the sociological sense of producing a code book where you kind of collapse these stories and then kind of like off camera, and then you read them and interpret them, and then you produce scholarship. I've worked on things like that before, and I don't like it. And I wanted this to be a public-facing project with a public-facing community that's visible to the user, and to let the people speak for themselves, essentially.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that question?
I think for us, one of the big considerations in terms of giving back to the community or being in relation to the community the project is for and about had a lot to do with what my co-curator and I wanted to do in terms of situating Japanese American community in relation to kind of Indigenous removal, in relation to Black removal from the city of Detroit and the destruction of historically Black neighborhoods. Because the Japanese American community is multiple and has a lot of opinions on whether they see those connections or see those responsibilities or not. And we imagine that there would be pushback from some people who are like, why are we talking about these other people in this exhibit that's meant to tell our story that also often does not get highlighted? Why are we sharing this space, right? And so one of what we want, that's what we wanted to do. We really wanted that to be part of this narrative, particularly in relation to the other exhibits at the Detroit Historical Museum. And so being the exhibit really functions as a conversation that goes both ways, right? For viewers who understand themselves to be part of the community in Detroit, to think about Japanese American history as part of it, and also for Japanese Americans, not only to see their own story in the way that they understand it, but also to think about ways that that narrative might be expanded as well to include their neighbors in the Metro Detroit area.
Thank you. I'll ask another question as we're just waiting for some raised hands from the audience. I'm curious who did you envision as your audience for your projects, and how did that shape the project? Oh, sorry, Caitlin, I didn't see your question. Oh, very sorry. I'm going to jump to that real quick. Thanks, Mika, for pointing that out. So Caitlin asks, I'm wondering if folks can talk a little bit about funding, securing it, accountability, and pushing back against the kind of single author genius mode of artist production that usually attends on funding streams. Thanks for that question, Caitlin.
There are aspects of storing extinction that I do not understand. I cannot reproduce them on my own. Things about managing data and code. I've tried to learn it, but I couldn't do it in the time that I would need to produce a project. And so that portion belongs to somebody else who collaborated with us on this project. And that's why collaboration is great, because it's okay to not understand things and still want to produce them, if that makes sense.
I can speak to some of the funding question. I definitely related to that part of Jack's presentation, where it involved a lot of filling out grant applications that did not pan out to anything. But I think, honestly, one of the things that made this project possible is that both my co-curator and I were being paid enough, either as graduate students on fellowship or working her normal 9-to-5 job, that we could do this work without needing to be paid in order to continue paying rent and buying food. And so that really is beholden to, for instance, our graduate institutions and what stipend they're giving people to live on. And to know that the work will likely be unpaid and that you will put your own finances into a project if that's something that you are comfortable with and you choose to do in addition to your time, because it is part of giving back to that community and being part of a community. That is something that's easy to say if you're like rolling in cash. It's something that's a little bit harder to say when you are on a graduate student stipend. But again, I think really what it pans down to is if institutions are excited about these projects and want their students to be doing them, then they need to pay their students enough to live. And that's really kind of the major the major push here.
Yeah, if I could jump in, and sorry folks, I'm not going to turn my camera on because I have a small child crawling on me right now, who might start screaming, so I'll just mute if he does. But as far as the funding goes, I think the zine project, we benefited structurally from having April as like a designated professor of public humanities. She had some institutional support. She was able to get a grant to pay Melody to put together the graphic design for the project. That was the hard money we needed. But I think, and this is just my interpretation of how we work together, gave her a lot of impetus and an ability to say, like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing with my paid time and what I'm doing for tenure. And the rest of us who may also be able to feel that way, but didn't have it as so explicitly laid out, were able to join in and be a part of that process. Sorry, it's hard to like think as this is juggling here. And what I think is important about that is that, you know, a lot of us don't have the job of like professor of public humanities. And so if you're a grad student or you're a new faculty member or a VAP or whatever, to like have those conversations with your mentors, your tenure committee, your supervisors early and often about what it is you want to do and how you want your work to be valued. Whether that's like, how am I preparing for my dissertation work or am doing my dissertation, or, you know, how do I want my scholarship to be understood or where I'm making my interventions. I think that helps set up like a way that you know, the pay scale, that's not the right way to say it, but allows you to get that sort of the credit for what you're doing, especially if it's outside of the normal realm of academic knowledge production or documentation. I think I'm about to go up for tenure, and it was helpful to sit with my tenure committee and explain like why this fits into my narrative ahead of time. And they could write a very supportive documentation like as we were going through, which helps give cover to not put your time and money in other things. If that makes sense. Sorry, I feel like I'm in full word salad mode with Jonah on my arms here.
That's really helpful. Did anyone else, any of the other presenters want to speak to this question?
I just want to emphasize what Caitlin wrote in the chat, because I think that's so true about in terms of kind of scaling to the level of the dissertation in graduate school, right? That this is also, you know, Shane framed it in terms of, you know, tenure, but this is also an important conversation about alternatives to the traditional dissertation, this sort of work for sure. I know that some programs are moving in the direction where this kind of work is not only respected, but actively welcomed. But I think, unfortunately, it's definitely not yet the norm.
Thank you for that. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and thank you so much for everyone who's stuck in a whole 20 minutes beyond our end time. I want to invite the presenters, if you're willing to take questions later, to put your emails in the chat so that our participants could follow up with questions they maybe didn't get a chance to ask or that occurred to them later. So throw those in the chat in the next few moments, please, if you're willing. And thank you again to the presenters for sharing your really great work with us. Really appreciate that. And yeah, we'll be, please keep an eye out for our next grad student workshop. It'll be another professional development workshop based on the poll that we did at the beginning of the workshop today. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I think the recording will record to my computer, hopefully. I know Cassie started the recording and I'm here, so hopefully I will be able to share that with you all later if you want. And yeah,